Monster Hunter World released back in January of this year to wide critical acclaim, to this day sitting pretty with an aggregate score of 90 on Metacritic. The game's success was vitally important for the franchise, as it marked the first time in a decade that Capcom set their sights on the general mainstream player base as target customers. Release after release, the series has been monumentally popular in the East. However, overseas sales have always fallen short, despite the very active presence of a small but rabid fan base. There are many reasons for the disparity between the Eastern and Western figures. However, two of the biggest can be attributed to the inherent complexity of the series' mainstay mechanics and the drastic differences between American and Japanese marketing. I want to take an in-depth look at how Monster Hunter World has bridged the gap into becoming a global hit, what it could mean for the future of the industry, and what are the circumstances leading into the PC release this week. Although equally impactful, the split between Eastern and Western markets is a simple one, so we can start here. While still sizable, sales of handheld platforms have declined in Europe and North America as both consoles and PC have become more accessible, while cell phones have filled a gap in lightweight portable gaming as solid mobile platforms. In Japan, where commuting and public transportation are the most common methods for getting around, handheld gaming platforms have dominated for the better part of 2 decades. Because of this, Japanese consumers and their interests largely determine which titles are developed for systems like the PS Vita and Nintendo 3DS. The Monster Hunter franchise has had a definitive impact on the life cycles of both since its inception. This concentration of likely potential customers has been a predictable and homogeneous demographic to market towards, with campaigns that would never have succeeded in America, just as typical American marketing would fail to influence sales overseas. Throw in a complicated slate of versioning for the franchise in a similar vein as Final Fantasy, as well as mechanics that serve as blisteringly high barriers to entry, and it's no wonder that on these merits alone, the series never became as insanely popular globally as it did for the region. Comparatively, the more interesting reason for the series' geographic stagnation, relative to this video's discussion, is the typical gameplay split commonly seen between the cultures. Monster Hunter is a series of immense complexity, with no handholding for series newcomers, and is replete with mechanics common in other Japanese-only titles that seem both unintuitive and cryptic to Western players. The gameplay is incredibly strategic, but doesn't always seem so on the surface, causing many Westerners used to the fast-paced action games typically released to find the controls confusing, clunky, and without the proper context of their use, deeply dissatisfying. Throw in some cute cats, inaccessible itemization, and overly complex UI elements common in Japanese gaming, and you've probably tipped the scales of interest outside the scope of your typical Western player. Until recently, this had been my only serious exposure to the franchise as a whole. A few friends were deeply ensconced with Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, and were able to convince me to give it a shot. I barely made it 5 hours in before giving in to frustration and confusion. For many releases, these were the circumstances that kept the titles from reaching a universal audience. Although with each new edition, a small sect of Western players continued to grow. That is, until the Monster Hunter World reveal trailer at E3 last year. Speculation ran its course in all directions as people landed on their overall expectations, of which there were 2 primary camps. Those who thought this would be the Monster Hunter to finally bridge the cultural gap, and those who thought the attempt to do just that would destroy the title altogether. This was to be the first Monster Hunter game to feature open, living regions, semi-open world by design, and also the first time in a console generation they would attempt to target the graphically intensive scale of the strongest console platforms, PS4 and the Xbox One. With the new platforms came a new potential player base, one not so savvy to the mechanical intricacies that those familiar with the franchise had already mastered. There are many gamers who couldn't care less about Monster Hunter as a series, but the success of this game has both impacted the industry and been a message to publishers concerning what could be accomplished if approached with care and attention. So many months after release, and with the sales figures in tow, we can see that with over 7.5 million copies sold globally, Monster Hunter World has sold more units and has become more successful than any other Capcom IP. To be clear, it sold more than any Resident Evil, Mega Man, or even Street Fighter game before it, an unbelievable accomplishment for a series that has always struggled with being totally inaccessible outside of its small sphere of influence. How was this accomplished? How was this aging franchise brought into the current generation so successfully? As mentioned earlier, the big concern surrounding the game's announcement and subsequent information was that by focusing on such a beautiful, semi-open world design, the game's core mechanics and subsystems would have to be reworked. And because of the driving necessity to appeal to new players in Western markets, many feared these gameplay reworks would lose the complexity and nuance that had made them so special to so many players for the last 15 years. The inclusion of new hunter tools, the automatic crafting of certain recipes and ammo types, changes to the movesets of the game's 14 weapon types, the number of how many of the franchise's monsters could reasonably be included, and so much more were all topics of great contention on the game's subreddit for the months between the game's announcement and eventual release. The pressure placed on Capcom was enormous. It became clear quickly that this would probably be their last shot for a long time to expand the franchise's reach. A failure here would set the series back in the eyes of the industry for a long time. Ultimately, what they were able to achieve with this game should serve as a message for all developers and the industry at large. The fans of the franchise are a fierce bunch and would not concede their concerns idly, yet almost universally they have admitted that the systems, combat, and multiplayer have evolved in a way that doesn't subtract from the experience, but adds to it, all the while making it accessible and enjoyable for players like myself and many others. The changes all seem a natural evolution of the series' modernization. Technical restrictions that used to burden its developers are now lifted, and with it comes some defining new freedoms. In previous installments, the map was broken into sections that required loading screens in order for players to move between them. In practical application, this was both abusable and a hindrance when applied to fighting and tracking the game's various monsters, as players were able to duck through a load gate to heal, or similarly, monsters would escape through several loading screens as they ran back to their den. Removing the resource obstacles that forced this sectional design has allowed the devs to craft a number of independent ecosystems of colossal scale, maps where the wildlife is able to exist entirely without your presence. Predators will attack prey, monsters will have turf wars, and little details will flood your screen and paint a convincing picture of a living, breathing slice of nature, unburdened by traditional resource restrictions of past systems. This has more of an influence than you may originally think. While it's true that the battles fans have been fighting in their imaginations for over a decade are now fully realized graphically, the untethered map lends itself to a much more organic experience when tracking or observing your targets. The introduction of scout flies to aid in navigation is one of the smart, multi-purpose inclusions I mentioned earlier, an adaptation of previous methods of tracking that complements the new world architecture, isn't offensive to series veterans, and does a great deal to ease new players into the gameplay loop and crafting system. The scout flies will highlight things of interest in your immediate vicinity, from mining nodes to monster tracks, and once you've been able to find enough tracks or feathers or scales for whichever creature you're targeting, the flies will lead you along the track straight to your goal. This is a great deal more useful than the previous method of having to locate a monster by roaming the map and then tagging it with a paintball to keep its location known. This feels like a more natural, involved system that much more closely simulates what animal tracking is like. Little changes like this litter the overall experience that are nothing particularly notable alone, but together have brought a sweeping update to the Monster Hunter formula. Auto-crafting common consumables and ammo types, demystifying the cooking and buff mechanics, and clearer pop-ups for tutorial texts all serve the dual purpose of streamlining the gameplay for experienced veterans and inviting the eager masses into the fold, allowing the experience to truly become a universal one. All that being said, this isn't so much a video about the gameplay of Monster Hunter World, which is of course phenomenal, but more so about the importance of its success as part of a broader group of titles. In the past several years, we've seen very niche games such as Monster Hunter, Bloodborne, and Nier Automata become mainstream hits, each selling millions of copies and raining down profits on publishers for their gambit. Truly classic titles like these have always been made, and they always will be, because there are a ton of development studios that will make the games they want to make instead of what the profit margin might dictate, and sections of the gaming fan base will scream their praises from the rooftops for doing so, as they should. The real problem facing the industry and fans of it is the behavior of big-name publishers and where they deem risk worthwhile for a reward that may never come. For every Monster Hunter World, there are 100 like it that couldn't get funding to be made. For every Bloodborne, there are an endless number of titles that had their difficulty and deepest mechanics gutted because the publisher didn't think it would be engaging to players. For every Nier Automata, There are a slew of games that weren't allowed to tell a deeply engaging, complex story because players' ability to relate and chew on its themes were drastically underestimated. Whether we like to think it or not, the games we have on offer are very rarely just the product of a development team's ambitions, but more so what publishers think will ship the most units. My point here is not that evil publishers are abusing players or the industry at large. This is a free market system at work, and work it does, but instead that we as players need to make it clear that taking risks on games is good for everyone. After nearly 20 Monster Hunter releases, it was a massive risk for Capcom to change their core gameplay loop, switch the format entirely, and welcome a neglected section of the gaming community into the fold. Thank God they did, because it has reinvigorated the franchise and given the world a damned good title that otherwise wouldn't have seen the light of day. The same could be said for countless other gems that took players by storm and the industry by surprise. In an age of yearly installments, fueled by the success of Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed and the like, where development speed and monetization platforms are equally or more important than creativity or innovation, it is critically important that we, as consumers, help show that there are other roads to success. The dramatic backlash concerning microtransactions over the past year, brought into focus through Battlefront 2, has caused gaming consumers as a whole to become more savvy to the process their favorite games go through to make it to an actual release date, and how important the vision of future profits is to whether or not a publisher will pick them up at all. So many of us being aware to this sometimes ugly reality is a gift, because with our collective spending power and informed voices, we are in a position to help open up the landscape to allow further diversity in the titles that are developed instead of just the same old uninspired trends. The reason I bring this up now is that for similar but also different reasons, it is important that Monster Hunter World is also successful on PC. PC and console titles for a long time were as close to divided as you can be. There has always been some level of cross-platform porting that has happened between PC and console, but these ports were often only half finished with buggy versioning and crappy controls. Today, cross-platform titles have never looked better as publishers and developers are becoming more and more aware that these ports are very much worth their time. Allowing universality into their player base has extended the lifespan of many games far further than could reasonably be expected. This comes with its own set of risks though, as allowing for cross-platform play is still incredibly rare, and even developing different versions for cross-platform release is a costly and difficult time sink during development cycles. A game like Monster Hunter, typically relegated to handhelds, recently updated for consoles, and now being pushed into the PC sphere, is fairly unusual, but if met with success could help cement this practice of bringing fantastic titles to everyone. This won't work for console exclusives as they make up profits that are lost on the consoles themselves, but for the sea of third-party franchises that find popularity on console, they could go even further with a wider release. This is good for PC players because they gain expanded offerings to choose from, and it's good for console players because further popularity boosts the likelihood of better games being made in the franchises that they love. This is made even better by the growing practices concerning cross-platform play, as boosting a player base by a factor of 2 or 3 does amazing things for the longevity of games and the health of their communities. I don't mean to lay an extra burden at your feet when deciding what to buy or not to buy, nor do I intend to place responsibility on consumers for the practices of publishers. In fact, I don't even blame the publishers for fulfilling their responsibilities to earn. No. All I request is that we all support things that we like. If you're having a hard time picking between a handful of titles, consider maybe the not so obvious factors that led to each game's realization, and support the one that almost didn't make it, but has flourished because it did. If you're able to stay informed about what's going on in the industry, then I would encourage you to do it. By staying informed and supporting things that we like to see, over time we can shift the gaming landscape into something even better than what we have now, something that continues to improve year after year. Monster Hunter World releases today on PC, August 9th for those watching later, and is available on Steam. It is a game steeped in history and established as a classic, already having seen unbelievable success on console, and if you're at all interested, I would highly suggest looking into it. It is a game unlike anything outside of its franchise, and is not going to be for everyone by any means, but it certainly was able to captivate me for going on 100 hours now. Watch a review or some gameplay, and if you're still intrigued, then I would encourage you to check it out for yourself. This video is clearly not a review for the game. After playing the PC version and ensuring everything has maintained its initial integrity, I will put out a review of my own. Expect that sometime next week. Even if you have no interest in the franchise at all, I would ask that you give what we covered here some thought in the future as it applies to other franchises, and also would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. I'm interested to know what everyone thinks, as this is a different kind of video from what I typically make. I do my best to answer every comment, so thoughtful discussion is always encouraged. Thank you very much for giving me the time to watch this video, and if you're new, thank you for taking the risk on a small, unverified channel. I hope you liked what you saw. Please make sure to subscribe if you want to see more, and hit the notification bell to be notified immediately when new content is released. Again, thank you all so much for watching, and take it easy till next time.